Shabbat Shalom, everyone. You know, there is a meme that is going around the internet these days. If you don't know what a meme is kind of a funny idea that everyone picks up on and adds to around the internet. And the name of this particular meme is, I was today years old when. So let me explain what that means. So somebody, for example, put on, I was today years old when I realized that when you're auditioning for a part in a play and they say break a leg, it means we hope you get into the cast. Get it? Break a leg in the cast? I was today years old. I never knew that before. Or another example, when somebody says, hold your horses, it means they're telling you to be stable. Get it? Hold your horses, stable. I was today years old. I never realized it. Go no, right? It's, in other words, it means that I got my whole life and I never even realized that what these things meant and they were right in front of my face, right? The internet is full of such narishkeit, as of course we all know. I mean, the things I have learned that those tabs on the cans of soda, they have a little circle in them. You know why? Because you put your straw in them and it keeps your straw at the right angle all the time. Or I've learned that in a Tic Tac, on the lid, there's a little dispenser on the lid so that it always dispenses one Tic Tac at a time. Did you ever know that? Go no, right? So, you know, I read these things, and being a rabbi, being the philosophical sort, it got me thinking of all of the things that have been right in front of my nose that I simply never knew. And I'm today years old every time I learn these things. It could be silly things like those examples, or it can be really serious social ills. I mean, how many years of my life did I go through and never realize what an incredibly misogynist and racist society we live in? And you know why I never fully realized it? Because it never directly affected my immediate experience. So I simply didn't notice it. And it even gets even more earth-shatteringly personal in my own life. Despite constant evidence to prove it, I never put together that I was gay until I was in my 40s. There are all these things that are right in front of your face and you just don't see it. Isn't that remarkable? You know, of course, all these examples are very different from each other, right? The narishkeit examples are things you never notice because they're just not important enough to notice. The social ills are things that we don't notice because, you know, in some ways we all inhabit some kind of bubble of power or privilege that prevents us from seeing such social ills. And for the big personal revelatory things, often we don't notice those because we're simply too afraid to look and see because the implications are much too frightening. So they're all quite different, of course. But what they all have in common is very interesting. They all point out that in our human journey of life, we all go through life with blinders on, don't we? We just automatically, for a whole host of reasons, filter out information, sometimes incredibly important information. And it's not just that we're denying it, we're self-denying it. We're denying ourselves sometimes because it doesn't match how we want to understand our world. In the Torah, we read about the life of Jacob. And Jacob, of course, is a prime example of somebody who lives a life filled with deception and also self-deception. We're very well aware, of course, of the ways in which Jacob is deceitful. We know the story of how Jacob fools and tricks his blind old father and steals the blessing of the firstborn from his brother Esau. That one we know well. But what's not quite as well known is how easily Jacob is willing to deceive himself. It's very interesting, you know, when he does trick his father and his father gives him the blessing of the firstborn, the blessing that his father gives him isn't all that spectacular, right? If you actually read the words, the blessing is basically, may you have a life of abundance, may everybody respect you. That's really all it's saying. What's interesting is after the whole deception is revealed and his father realizes that he gave the wrong blessing to him, and just before Jacob runs away, his father blesses him again. And you know what his father says to him? He says, "V'yatein lecha k'birkat Avraham." May God give you the blessing that God gave to Abraham. He says it. when he knows exactly who Jacob is, which means that that blessing was never supposed to go to Esau in the first place. It was supposed to go to Jacob. But guess what? Jacob doesn't seem to notice that he got the blessing from dad, the one that he thought he had to steal. And what's worse, that same night, Jacob runs away into the desert and he goes to sleep in the middle of the desert, and he has the famous dream of Jacob's ladder. They live going from earth to heaven with the angels going up and down, and God is at the top of the ladder, and God is blessing Jacob and says, I will keep you safe, and I will be with you, and I will bring you back to this land, and all the nations of the earth will bless themselves by you and your descendants. Guess what? That's the blessing that went to Abraham too. But did Jacob notice it? He doesn't seem to notice it at all. In fact, when he wakes up, he is completely oblivious to it. And all he says is, well, if God keeps me safe, then I'll believe in God. Essentially, that's what he says. What is up with Jacob? He doesn't see it. He not only got it from dad, he even got it from God. And he still doesn't believe that he has this blessing. We live in a fascinating time, don't we, nowadays? We live in a country where millions of people seem to believe conspiracy theories, and we're totally mystified. Why do so many millions of people seem to be believing in such crazy ideas and conspiracies in their world? Why would people believe QAnon? Why would people believe why would there be anti-vaxxers? Why would people believe that the coronavirus was deliberately engineered in some dastardly lab in China to try to make the world sick? That's meshuggah. And we don't understand, even when the facts are readily available, people still believe this nonsense. How could that be? I was listening not long ago to an NPR show, and they were talking to a social psychologist, and he basically explained what we all suspect, which is when a human being is confronted with contradictory facts or just information that seems to contradict each other, we will automatically filter out one of them and choose the one that more closely resembles our already held beliefs and values and opinions. And once we make that link, we will defend that set of facts to the hilt, no matter what anybody else says. And this is why it is absolutely futile to argue with somebody who believes in conspiracy theories by presenting them with the facts. Because you know why? Once somebody has reached the point where they're believing in a conspiracy theory, when they're believing in a crazy set of facts or an idea, then it is personal, it is emotional, it is linked to their identity, and they will defend it like they're defending their own life and their own self. Now, before we look at people like that and tisk and think how pitiable they are, I think there's a message that rises up from the Torah that tells us, you know what? We all do this to various degrees all the time in our lives, right? It's not just the conspiracy theory people. Just like the examples I gave from my life, there are things that we don't see because we don't think they're important. There are things we don't see because they don't enter into our social circles or our community. And there are things that we just don't want to deal with because they would make us uncomfortable. We are all doing this all the time. In fact, it's a necessary part of our human nature, isn't it? We've evolved to be creatures who filter out huge amounts of information. And why? Because the sensory information alone is overwhelming that we're receiving. We have to filter things out and only hold on to the facts that match our previous opinions and ideas and experiences. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to function in our lives. The problems, of course, occur when this filtering process turns into horrific denial in an immoral sense. It can go awry. And that's what we're seeing so much in our society these days. It's very disturbing stuff. Jacob was guilty of this, wasn't he? He was so jealous of his brother. He was so full of grievances over the fact that he was not born first. He was so resentful of his father for loving Esau more than he loved him. He simply was completely attached to his own victim script. So he couldn't notice, even when his father gave him the blessing, even when God blessed him, he couldn't notice. It would take him many years before he finally noticed. There's a really interesting moment in our Parsha when Jacob arrives in Haran after running away from his brother. And there's the famous scene where he's at the well and in Haran, and there's a big giant stone covering the well, and we're in 3 different flocks and shepherds come. And then usually it takes all the shepherds to get together to move the giant stone. But then who arrives? But none other than the beautiful Rachel, his bride-to-be, and he is love-struck, love at first sight, and he's so overcome with love for Rachel that Jacob single-handedly goes and pushes the stone off the rock that normally takes many, many men to move. Lots of wonderful commentaries on the symbolism of this moment throughout the rabbinic tradition. To boil them all down, essentially what you learn is that rock represents all of the impediments that we have, our Yetzer Hara, all of our doubts, all of our delusions, and the well represents the wellspring of God's love and God's wisdom and Torah, and all the things that block us from that. And beautiful teachings like, just like all the shepherds had to join together, all of Israel must join together. And when we truly join together, we can overcome the Yetzer Hara. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. But I want to point out something obvious, which is the literary level of the story. Jacob is love-struck. He is so in love with this beautiful woman that he doesn't even know. He wants to impress her so much that he goes and he moves this giant stone off the block, which of course shows us in the arc of the story how much Jacob, despite all of his deceptiveness, is ultimately worthy of the blessing that he's already gotten twice in his life. He's worthy of it. Why? Because he actually has strength within him that he never realized that he had. In fact, Jacob is a man who can move mountains. He can overcome all of his self-deception and all of his self-willed ignorance to the truth. You can say it's because of, a beautiful woman and he's love-struck, but ultimately what the story is showing is that he is able to come out of his self-absorption and embrace the blessing that he is. Ultimately, he will become unstuck. It will take him decades to get there. But ultimately, he's going to meet up years later with that angel in the middle of the night. That's next week's Parsha. And he's going to struggle with the angel. And in that, he's going to find the strength to overcome that angel, which represents all of his denial and his self-delusion. And he's going to prevail and become Yisrael. And it's at that moment that he realized that not only did he always have the blessing, but that he is the blessing. He never had to get it in the first place. It's who he is. And that's why Jacob becomes such a beautiful typology, not only for his descendants, the children of Israel, but really for our human condition. We are all capable of more. We are all capable of overcoming our fears and our angers and our grievances and our self-denials when we are motivated truly by our capacity to love. When we follow that path, it's not just Jacob, but all of us are capable of moving mountains. All of us can cast off our ignorance. All of us can see past our own deceptions and lies and partial truths that we take to encompass everything. All of us can discover that even though we have this natural tendency to filter out and to delude ourselves, we also have in our humanity the capacity to transcend that, to embrace truth and to be a blessing. That also is what it means to be in the image of God. It's true that we all have that stone over the wellspring of our soul, don't we? Whether it be our Yetzer Hara or our denial or our fears. And remember, it's not just the Meshuggah people who are believing in conspiracy theories. That's a pitfall that each and every one of us all have. And I think that there is deep value in us acknowledging that that is a shared human pitfall. Because when we gather our wisdom together and understand that we all have this pitfall, that's the only way, just like those shepherds, we can move that stone off that wellspring as a society. And we can discover that just like Jacob, we all are the embodiment of extraordinary blessing to transform the world. Indeed, that is each and every one of our birthright.